Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nathan. I'm one of the co-founders of the Election Truth Alliance. Today we're going to be talking about California. So this video, we're going to look at a few counties in California, highlights any concerns, and kind of get into the data analysis. We'll make this very quick, concise, and simple. We will have a Substack post hopefully up soon, kind of covering some of these concerns in a little more depth, but we're going to talk about why analyze California. So if you're not familiar, California actually had, I believe, 3 bomb threats, at least 3 counties targeted with bomb threats after election night. It was Los Angeles County, Orange, and Riverside counties. And what was very interesting, and we'll dive in a little deeper, is why those areas. And so some other interesting things is, although the state was won by Harris in this case, we did see a decrease of around 16.5% in the amount of Democratic voters across the state. And what's more interesting is Trump's votes actually grew by around 1.5 or 1.25%. The state does use a mix of election machine brands. Los Angeles County here actually has a unique system as well. So Los Angeles County is the first we're going to look at. They have a population of around 9.66 million. They're the largest by density. Then you have Orange County. They're the 3rd largest. Alameda County, they're the 7th, and Tulare County, they're the 18th. And what's interesting is all 3 of these first ones all voted predominantly Harris. Tulare County voted around 59% for Trump. Now, we'll jump into the bomb threats. So there was over 200 bomb threats. Majority of them were centered around more dense precincts and counties. A lot of them were in Pennsylvania, but there were some in Arizona, California, and other places, the Great Lakes area specifically. And so, as I said, Orange and Riverside County on the night of the 8th and the 9th, when they were processing votes, they had received bomb threats and evacuated the buildings. On the 9th as well, Los Angeles County received bomb threats. And what's very interesting, as we said, is it's not as much the bomb threats, it's how organized and coordinated these bomb threats were. That raises questions of, who would do this and what benefits could they, what opportunities would bomb threats create if you wanted to mess with our elections. And as we mentioned, and we talk about this a lot, I'm sure if you're kind of paying attention with some of the stuff going on in New York, Rockland County right now, we highlight that the top 2 brands are used all across the U.S. There's also a 3rd or 4th brand that we like to highlight, but in this case, these top 2 brands have been raised as concerns for vulnerabilities. And if you were to compromise these top 2 brands alone, not including the 3rd or the 4th largest, could you manipulate elections? Potentially you could. If you've compromised these major brands and the tabulation process as a whole, you could potentially change the outcome of the presidential election and perhaps some state elections like the House and the Senate representatives as well. Now, let's talk about statistics real quick. People say, statistics is not proof of anything, and that's true. Statistics cannot prove election fraud, but statistics can highlight anomalies that, when investigated, is evidence and could lead to proving election fraud. Examples of this were in Bladen County in North Carolina in 2016 and 2018, where there was absentee ballot fraud, and they were doing a ballot harvesting and forging scheme. They found some anomalies in things not adding up, and went and investigated, and they actually did find this fraud and re-ran the congressional election because of that. Philadelphia, there was a judge that was actually accepting bribes and casting fraudulent ballots. This was detected because, at the time, Al Schmidt noticed anomalies. He noticed irregularities in the tallies, and this got reported, and then they investigated and proved this. I think in that case, it was a Democrat-based judge. I think it was benefiting the Democratic Party. And then, of course, you have one of the more interesting ones, which was in New Hampshire, where there was a 400 vote discrepancy, and it was found in an audit, forensic audit, and was attributed to dust and folds in the ballots. So I do want to highlight, when people say statistics and this level of analysis isn't able to prove anything, it won't prove fraud, but it can be used to detect fraud. And that's what's important. For example, you use statistical analysis for financial fraud and can actually use that as an indicator, and you find flags, and then you go and you investigate further. So we highlight that statistics in this case should be able to point us to where to look and audit and find if the anomalies are caused by something or caused by malicious activity. Now we're going to do some analysis here. Here's our turnout analysis. Turnout is the statistical analysis of vote count versus turnout, or in this case, how many votes a candidate is getting, how many people are showing up to vote, and in places where more people voted, is any one candidate getting more of those votes. If that trend is consistent across multiple precincts, enough to create a pattern, that is a red flag because it could be malicious in nature. This is based off the work of Roman Udot and Sergei Sphilkin. And for example, Roman Udot has highlighted turnout concerns in Russian elections, both, going back for quite a while. And he also highlighted the 2024 country of Georgia, their Dream Party election, which was attributed to potential Russian election interference. So we're just going to break this down and we'll highlight exactly what's going on here. Now, in this case, what we're seeing is you're seeing turnout on the bottom and the number of votes on the y-axis. And you're just seeing that is any one candidate rapidly growing in the amount of votes in places where there were more votes cast. And in this case, we see that the Georgian Dream Party votes began to grow after a certain turnout. And then they began to overtake the other parties. That's all they're highlighting here. And in this case, it's based upon gender deviation, and that's what he based his work off of. In this case, it's Roman Udot. Now, Sergei Sphilkin, similar thing. There, he's applying it based off of turnouts, votes, and I believe polling locations. And so he likes Russian elections, and he's done this for multiple elections that have been attributed to potential election fraud, abnormalities that got blamed on ballot stuffing and other indications. And this is where you hear the term Russian tail. It's a inflated tally where you've potentially been stuffing votes, and it causes a tail where turnout spikes. As I said, what causes this is you've got 0 to 100% turnout. Turnout is a measurement of, let's say you've got 100 people who are registered to vote in a location. How many people showed up to vote? If 80 people showed up to vote, you're at 80% turnout. If 5 people showed up to vote, you're at 0.05% turnout, or whatever, 0.5% turnout. So all we're looking at here is in places where more votes were cast versus places where less votes were cast. So you see all of these candidates are similar in shape, although they may be getting a different amount of votes. The shape of their distribution is more of the same. And then we see after a certain point, for example, 65% turnout, Putin, in this case, begins to grow in the amount of votes he's getting. And this is just highlighting potential ballot stuffing in this case. So we're going to apply both of these experts' work in looking at California. And on the left is that more normal, you don't see any rapid change. On the right is that tail, or that potential stuffing. Now let's jump into U.S. elections and California as a whole. We're going to highlight first what does normal look like in the U.S. In this case, we have Wisconsin in 2025, Justice of the Supreme Court, Susan Crawford. If you're familiar with that race, that was recent, that was big. We want to highlight this because this is more normal looking, in the case that we don't see any rapid change for either candidate, as turnout had increased across all of these precincts in the state as a whole. So this is county level data, but it's broken down by precincts. And so what we're actually seeing is from places, let's say 50% turnout, 50% of people, half of people who couldn't vote showed up to vote, versus places, where 80% did, is any one candidate growing in a noticeable amount. We don't really see a noticeable amount of change. I will highlight the only thing that is super abnormal and warrants a little further digging is, for example, we have a 20,000 lead or so here, around 60% turnout. But as we hit 65 or so, we notice that lead shrinks just a little bit. And then it returns to a much larger turnout here. So overall, this looks far more normal. And on the right here, we have Pennsylvania 24 presidential election, mail-in. This is actually all of Pennsylvania, every county in Pennsylvania for mail-in. And I think actually it's the 3 counties we like to highlight. So it's going to be Erie, Philadelphia, and Allegheny counties in this case. And so all we're showing is that we're not seeing any rapid shifts for mail-in voting. Both candidates generally are sitting around a certain percent, even though Harris is winning in mail-in and Trump is not. We're not seeing any one candidate spiking up as turnout in places of higher turnout versus places of lower turnout. That's all we're looking at. So these are both pretty good examples of more normal. Now we're going to jump into Los Angeles County to begin. So we see mail-in still looks far more normal. We're not noticing any rapid shifts as from places of high to low turnout. That looks normal. I will highlight that that's their mail-in. Now we look at early voting and election day. We notice after about 10% or so when it looks like they stabilize and you get a good amount of data, we notice that Harris begins to excel and sit around a 40,000 or so vote advantage. We see that vote advantage sit from about the same, 40,000. And then once you get past 20% turnout right here, we notice that Trump actually begins to overtake Harris in the amount of votes and sit at a higher amount. That is very interesting. That warrants digging in a little further because, as we said, when we see this in European elections, it raises the concerns of if you were digitally ballot stuffing, for example, or physically ballot stuffing. But in this case, this is concern of if it was digital in nature, it would cause a rapid shift like what we're seeing here. This could be caused by other things, but this does warrant further investigation. Now we're going to look at Orange County. So Orange County, same thing, but in this case, we see no noticeable or rapid shift up until about 65%. Then we do actually start to see Harris's vote share shrink. As I said, this could be caused by a number of different things. You want to double check the data, make sure you have a good amount of data to review, look at the registration of the voters, what parties they're in. But overall, looks more normal. Now in this case as well, early voting and election day, we're not seeing anything amazingly weird here. No rapid change based off of this data. So it looks more normal here. There is an interesting shift, though, once you hit 25% or so, that both candidates are sitting. I would say the ratio looks about the same. So early voting election day, very small amount of votes, but looks more normal, no noticeable shifts. Now we're going to highlight Alameda County. So same thing, we're not seeing any spikes from places of low to high turnout, nor are we seeing any spikes in early voting or election day. So about the same, looks more normal. Now we're going to jump into the last one, which is Tulare, and then we'll show you heat maps. But what's interesting here is Tulare County. As I mentioned, this county did vote for Trump on average across all the precincts in the county, and he took the county. We do notice something interesting. So we see at the beginning precincts sitting around 40%, more split, and then we hit around 45. Harris begins to exceed. And then after that, for some reason, we begin to see that Trump matches, and then after 55% begins to overwhelmingly win across all of these higher turnout precincts. This is very strange. This does warrant some concerns. This raises flags. Why? Because we saw Harris was exceeding in the beginning, and then that rapid shift. And as I said, if you were to compare this to the Georgian Dream votes, it's the same concern where you have a more equal and normal race at the beginning. One candidate is excelling, and then after a certain percentage, precincts of higher turnout begin to have more votes for one candidate. And that's the same concern we're seeing here. This parallels the concerns of potential ballot stuffing. As I said, this warrants further investigation. Now we're going to go into heat maps real quick. This is based off the work of Peter Klimek et al. And they created these heat map visualizations for multiple Russian, Uganda, and Switzerland elections. He is an Austrian physicist. He's known for his election forensics. And they are really good about showing ballot stuffing and vote manipulation. So we could potentially detect vote switching with heat maps. And so we're going to dive in. Some baselines to look at is Russia, 2011. We see that a more fair modeled election should be a circle, should be spherical in nature. This is turnout based. The x-axis is turnout. We're seeing that in Russia, they have this comet trail up and to the right, and then they have stuffing at 100%, which is concerning. So if we're looking for a circle, we're going to look at how does these counties in California compare. So we're going to have a couple baselines first. We have Ohio, their nonpartisan state board. This is District 5. Vinegar, the winning candidate in this case. We see a more circular, more normal, more fair vote distribution. All these precincts are more circle. And we don't see any change for one candidate growing or shrinking the amount of votes as turnout had increased across these precincts, or precincts of high versus precincts of low turnout. So Erie, mail-in, same concern, circular in nature. We're not seeing any noticeable shifts. Now we're going to look at Los Angeles County again. This is their mail-in voting. What's interesting here is, as I said, if we're expecting a more circular distribution of votes, we do kind of get a circle. But what is more concerning is, although we get a circle, the density is supposed to be in the middle, right? We have this middle core. We're not seeing that. We're seeing a density of precincts over here. This is a little concerning. This warrants a little more digging. I'm very curious to look at the registration of these precincts and see how that compares, if these are more Republican or more Democrat registered precincts. But to see that slant here, where precincts of low turnout versus precincts of high turnout, higher turnout, the amount of precincts where Trump is getting votes seems to shift and grow. That is a bit of a concern. So this does warrant audits and investigations. This is mail-in. This is a significant amount of the votes as well. Now we'll look at their early voting and election day. We've broken it down by both candidates here so you can see it a little better. I do highlight, if we were to blow this up, we would do a range of votes from 0 to 40% and look at what that looks like. But in this case, for example, we look at Trump. If we were expecting a more circular distribution, we kind of get that. We don't see any shifts from low to high turnout as much. It's pretty vertical. But we do see a lot of precincts sitting a little higher than the middle amount of votes. And I'm just highlighting this because that is interesting to see. If, for example, if you were to stuff digitally, if you were to digitally switch votes across precincts, it would cause change in the up and down, but not the left and right. So we see a pretty interesting up and down here. A lot of precincts, very stretched up and down. And in this case, as I said, we're seeing a lot of precincts sitting higher than the average area. And we see the opposite for Harris. We see a lot of precincts that almost seems like they're sitting a little lower. So I do think this warrants a little more investigation as well. Now we're going to look at Orange County, their mail-in. This is the same type of concern we're seeing in Pennsylvania, honestly, and in North Carolina now as well, is we're seeing, instead of that more circular grouping of votes, we're seeing this these precincts sitting at more of a diagonal, where as in precincts of higher turnout, Harris is decreasing the amount of votes. Precincts of higher turnout, Trump is growing in the amount of votes. That is a concern. And it warrants further investigation, because if you were digitally ballot stuffing and causing turnout to grow because you're adding in votes and you're causing those precincts to have more Trump votes, for example, it would cause this shape. So this is interesting and does warrant a little more digging. And as I said, we're going to try and pull the registration data by party, because that lets us see very clearly what's going on. Okay, now we'll look at, that was Orange County mail-in. Now we're going to look at Orange County early and election day voting. Same concern we were seeing in the other county, but we do get a more circular distribution here, but we do actually see the opposite of what we were seeing in other places. We're seeing it more of a tail here, and the opposite for Harris, right, where some of these are pushed up. This is very interesting, right? Because at a glance, this would be like, oh, well, if this was caused by vote switching, would the vote switching potentially benefit the Democratic candidates? And in this case, as I said, like at a glance, it looks like it could. But as I said, what you want to look at as well is you want to look at the registration of these places and see how many people are registered as a Democrat versus registered as a Republican or a third party. Because that might let you determine what is the voter makeup, and if the votes are noticeably different than that makeup, you would be able to understand a little bit more what's going on. I will highlight, as I said, yeah, this could be caused by a benefit to Harris, or it could be caused as well by a majority of precincts being shifted up for Trump. This warrants further looks, and I'm very curious to see what we'll find when we look at that registration data. Now, last but not the least, actually we have one more after this. This is Alameda County. This is their mail-in. We don't see a circle. We see a very interesting split where some of the votes are sitting here, and some of the votes are sitting down here. Yeah, this is strange. You know, this could be unique to the area. Could be something specific to the demographic of voters. It could be, you know, two different types of demographics, right? Where you've got some of the precincts are really different than others, but this is very strange at a glance. And then, of course, we have the same concerns we're seeing almost everywhere else, where instead of a more circular distribution of votes, we get a lot of spreading out. And the same thing we were seeing with the last county is a denser amount of votes are sitting up here for Trump. So this does warrant a little more digging. And finally, we have Tulare County. And so Tulare County is the same, kind of that X, that cross. And it's, for, in this case, Trump, we're seeing a little bit of that up and to the right pattern across these precincts. Precincts of low turnout versus precincts of high turnout. As turnout, or as places where more votes were cast, more and more of those votes began to benefit Trump. And that's what this is showing. So I think this is all very interesting. As I said, this is kind of our first look in California as a whole. And as I said, where do we go from here? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want more data. You want to really break it down. You want to look at the demographic of voters, any abnormalities. You would expect California to be far more Democratic based in some of these larger areas. So it's very interesting to see the amount of Trump votes growing. So, as I said, thank you guys so much. We're going to kind of put this up on our Substack. North Carolina's coming out soon, hopefully, and you'll get to experience that as well. And you know, until then, you know, leave any, you know, you put in the comments what your thoughts are, what you think we should look at more, any other concerns or flags. So thank you guys so much.